flying across the ocean now. We're going to Australia. We're going to Queensland University. So we have Elizabeth Hutches, who is up next. Elizabeth, are you there? I think you're it
I
might be the
am.
middle of the
Yes,
night for you,
thanks.
so
Thanks for
maybe
having me.
hard to reach you.
Can you hear me okay?
Give it a minute or two. There you are. Hey, Elizabeth.
Hi there. Great to be with you.
You too. And Elizabeth, we see Elizabeth at almost all of our ahead events somehow, even though half of them are on in the middle of the night. So I'm really good that you're here with us today, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. It's my absolute joy to be here with you. I am joining from 1 a.m. my time in Sydney, but it is absolutely worth staying up for to share with people who are just as passionate as I am about UDL and making some really positive student experiences happen. So it's my absolute honour to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share screen, so I'll just take one moment to get that happening.
Yep, take it away, Elizabeth. Thanks for sharing with us.
Okay, so I'm here to talk to you today about UDL 3.0 in action, reducing student stress and enhancing inclusion in higher education. So this is part of my PhD research, and I'm gratefully recognising as well my wonderful supervisors, Stuart Woodcock, Melissa Johnston, and Dean Dudley. So I'm going to take us through what is the challenge that this is really trying to solve. How did that knowledge seeking come about? And of course, what's next? What do we do with it now? And this particular presentation is specifically focused on students' academic stress. So that is the stress that a student experiences in relation to their studies. So maybe it's about learning and achieving, maybe it is coming into that brand new university environment and trying to navigate those systems and processes. Maybe it's managing study alongside other commitments. And for many of our students today, that can be juggling work and study, but it can also be juggling family commitments or slotting in medical appointments and treatment around those studies too. So, what is the challenge with academic stress? Well, a little bit of stress can be positive, it can be motivating. But what we find is that when there's a high level of academic stress, in and of itself, it can impact physical health, mental health, students' quality of life, and interestingly, also their capacity to learn, which also impacts their academic achievement. So, quite a broad range of negative impacts of high stress. But the inverse of that is that reducing that high stress could have a broad range of positive impacts. But our context at the moment, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic here in Australia, we had about 84% of students reporting high stress, compared to only 29% of the general population, so very different levels. And since the onset of the pandemic, that has only seemed to increase, and the ability to cope with that stress tends to have decreased. But what I find really interesting is that when we look at students who might have accessibility requirements or disability, might have a chronic health condition, they tend to experience higher stress than their peers. And some research that I've conducted with colleagues seems to have found that when we compare students who have sought support or have sought those accommodations and compare them to those who have not, there is no statistically significant difference in those stress levels. But for those students who don't seek support, we know very little about their experiences overall. Our research doesn't tend to capture that unless it intentionally seeks to find those students. So the knowledge seeking then started. And it began with a systematic review to see what is happening to reduce stress across higher education. And unsurprisingly, a UDL approach is lacking. So we went on to an information gathering stage, hearing from students about what's contributing to that stress and viewing it through a UDL lens. And that is the first stage of information gathering of this study. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So what we've done is we've asked students what is contributing to your academic stress, and then had a look at what they're bringing up through the lens of UDL. So how can we align what they're talking about to the UDL guidelines? So I'm going to start with something that's quite front of mind for us, especially with AI, and that is assessment. And I'm going to read out a few pieces that students have mentioned to us and make those links to UDL. So we have a student who says there wasn't any feedback on my assignment, just a mark. I emailed the coordinator. They thought I wanted a remark. And they say these things may seem really small, but when combined, they feel huge. So what we're seeing here is action-oriented feedback being absent or inconsistent. We then have another student who says we wasted our time on meaningless repetitive tasks. So in this case, the relevance, value, and authenticity of that task hasn't been optimized. So here, we have assessment with barriers to engagement. Now, looking at the representation guidelines, we also have students talking about things related to assessment instructions that are difficult to comprehend. So students saying they're having to read between the lines and really wing it. And they're saying that this is particularly happening for neurodivergent students. And now action expression also came up as a barrier. So students saying, had exams, I was approved for computers, but there was no use of the extra time. So we've got students lacking access to accessible assessments, including to assistive technologies and tools. And we also have students who say that the mode of assessment is also a problem. So one student says all of the assignments are writing essays, which I think is terrible. So we have limited modes of assessment or modes that don't account for learner variability. So here we have assessment with barriers to action and expression. And so what I find interesting is if we look at those assessment-related stresses, we can plot those across the UDL guidelines, see where they line up with engagement, representation, and action and expression. And to me, I think this is really positive because we know what we can do by taking UDL-related actions to hopefully reduce or remove some of these stresses. Now I'm going to bring up another important aspect, which is students' participation. So participation in terms of their engagement and the barriers that we've seen come up here. So we've had some students say, I'm a mature age student. I feel like I don't belong due to my age. So when it comes to things like group assessments, I'm worried about not having a group to join. So we have students lacking belonging and lacking that connection. We also have students talking about participation through that lens of representation. So we have students saying, I find it hard to focus reading 30 plus pages. I'm sure many of us can agree that would be a challenging experience doing that depth of reading ready for one class. And here we can see it's one mode of media that is not being optimized for perception and building knowledge. And unfortunately, I'd hope we weren't still seeing this, but we still have students saying there's a lack of accessible course content. So things like no closed captions, poor sound quality, white backgrounds on everything. So we have information presented in inaccessible ways. Now, when we take that lens of action and expression, there are also stresses that students talk about here. So we have a student saying they were not offered online tutorials, and yet online tutorials meant they could join and do so while attending hospital appointments. Whereas in person, they were walking to class, managing that distance, dealing with social stress, and it was very overwhelming. So we have a mode of participation that didn't align with student needs, and yet we know there's another option. Now, interestingly, we also have students talking about the physical spaces. So desks and tables changing layout every week. And one student says this is very stressful for an autistic person having that frequent change. So physical spaces can also lack accessibility still. So like with assessment, we can take those participation-related stresses and map them across the UDL guidelines. And we see that we have stresses across engagement, representation, and action expression. But again, there are things that these guidelines tell us that we can do, and I'm strongly believing that we could reduce or even remove some of these stresses by taking UDL-informed actions. And why is this important? I want to bring us to some of the impacts that students tell us. So I alluded to some at the beginning, but here we get to hear students' voice. So we have a student talking about their health. Due to academic stress, I have headaches, stomach ulcer and gastritis, poor sleep. Small things feel bigger. I'm teary and short-fused. I isolate myself from friends and family in order to concentrate more time on my studies. And this can cause the academic stress can worsen as you have no other outlets or positive influences. So this is one student experiencing multiple health challenges that are exacerbated by stress. And we can also see that time that they're having to put into their studies to juggle that and balance that is also impacting on that social connection and their mental health. Now, we see impacts with motivation as well. And this student says it can go both ways. Either stress motivates me to do better, or I sometimes just give up. So there can be positive aspects to stress at that low level, but when we have that high level of stress or ongoing stress, that's when we really see the impacts. And what I think we'll all find very interesting is the impact of stress on students' deep learning, and students themselves are the ones that are recognizing this. So we have many students telling us the stress makes me focus on getting assessment tasks done on time instead of really learning and exploring the content. We have some students also saying, I just shut down if it gets too much, and this has resulted in 2 failing grades. Now, if we think about the intentions of our higher education courses and education in general, we want that deep learning to happen. We want that deep engagement with the material. And yet the level of stress is preventing students from reaching that goal that they really want to achieve. So what can we each take away? I think we can see that there are many stresses that are contributing to student stress in higher education at the moment, and we can see this is really important because there are significant health and learning impacts. But what really gives me hope is that mapping these stresses against the UDL guidelines, there is a way that possibly through UDL action, through proactively designing to reduce those stresses, we could perhaps reduce that stress. And in so doing, perhaps reduce some of those impacts to students' physical health, their mental health, and their academic journey. So what next? I'm excited to share that I'm at the final stage of this study. We have completed co-designing with students and staff to think about an accessible and inclusive intervention into this challenge. So how can we reduce that high stress? And importantly, whatever we put in place, proactive or reactive, how can we take that UDL lens and reduce as many barriers as possible? So whether we are supporting students when they are already highly stressed, or whether we are reducing that stress from the outset by removing some of those stresses, how can we take that UDL approach so that all students have equitable access to that? Now on screen at the moment, I have a QR code to my LinkedIn. So please feel free to link in with me and connect. And you can also connect with me via email. I'm going to read my email aloud. That is e.hitches, HITCHES, @uq.edu.au. I would love to stay connected. I would love to share these insights. And I would really love if you could take some of these ideas back to your own practice and to your own environments and see where might there be some unnecessary stresses that we could reduce. Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.